This problem affects almost every part of the business. What has happened to good workers? People you can trust. People you can trust to represent your company when you're not standing there watching them. I could grow, I could take on more jobs, but I just can't find good people. It goes way deeper than nobody wants to work anymore. Something trade organizations and labor studies have been talking about for years. A lot of construction business owners across America are asking kind of the same question right now. And, what has happened to good workers, right? And honestly, it's becoming one of the biggest pressures in the entire industry, right? It's not permits, it's not tools, it's not even materials. It's people. Reliable people, people who show up, people who care, people who take pride in the work. People you can trust. People you can trust to represent your company when you're not standing there watching them. And I keep hearing this same frustration from contractors, over and over and over again. I've got work, I could grow, I could take on more jobs, but I just can't find good people. Now look, before I go any further, I want to be upfront. I don't own a construction company. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I've got 20 years in running crews, framing houses, doing roofing, managing job sites at 5 in the morning. But I have spent a lot of time in the trenches as one of those workers. Okay. I also spend a massive amount of time, studying the industry, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help people in this industry. So I listen to contractors, I read industry reports, I watch interviews, I pay attention to labor market, the labor trends. So I look at what successful operators are saying, and this issue comes up constantly, not occasionally, constantly. And I think what makes this topic important is that it goes way deeper than nobody wants to work anymore, right? Because honestly, I think that phrase oversimplifies what's actually happening. There are real reasons this problem exists, and if construction business owners don't adapt to the reality of the labor market today, this problem is probably going to keep getting worse. So in this video I want to kind of talk about why construction companies are struggling to find reliable people, what's actually causing the issue, how it's affecting business owners, and some of the strategies experienced operators are actually using to navigate this problem. Not perfect answers, just practical observations from people that are actually inside the industry. So because I think this conversation actually matters. One of the biggest things happening right now is that construction has a massive aging workforce. A lot of experienced tradesmen are retiring, and for decades America pushes younger generations toward college while simultaneously discouraging trades. Kids were told, even I was told, don't go to work for construction, go sit behind a desk, you don't want a blue collar job, go get a degree, that kind of stuff, right? So meanwhile, the people actually building the country, the electricians, the plumbers, the roofers, heavy equipment operators, welders, framers, you name it, we're getting older, right? We're all getting older. And now we're seeing this, we're seeing the consequences of that shift. There simply aren't enough younger workers entering the trades to replace people leaving. That's not opinion, that's actually based on fact. That's something trade organizations and labor studies have been talking about for years. And it creates a massive imbalance, because demand for construction hasn't disappeared. If anything, demand is exploding. Housing, you got infrastructure, commercial work, industrial projects, you name it. America still desperately needs skilled labor, but there's a shrinking pool of experienced workers available to do the work, right? And that puts enormous pressure on business owners. But I also think there's another side to this conversation that doesn't really get talked about that much. A lot of younger workers entering the workforce today grew up in a completely different environment than us older generation people did. And again, that isn't about attacking younger people. It's just reality. The world has changed. Attention spans changed. Technology's changed. Social media's changed. Expectations have changed, and a lot of younger workers today are used to instant gratification, right? Fast entertainment, fast results, fast money, constant stimulation. Construction is the opposite of that, right? Construction is hard. It's early mornings, it's weather, physical exhaustion, long hours, pressure, accountability. Learning through mistakes, repetition, like major discipline, right? You don't become highly skilled in the trades overnight. It takes years. And some contractors are saying, they're seeing younger workers kind of struggle with that adjustment, right? Not all, obviously there are incredible young tradesmen out there, not, many owners noticing like lower patience, lower commitment, more job hopping, and like difficulty finding people willing to stick to the job long term. And when you combine that with social media constantly showing people shortcuts to success, construction can start to look less appealing to younger generations, right? Why spend years learning a trade when social media keeps telling people that they become rich overnight? And again, not saying that's everybody, right? But culturally, I think it absolutely plays a role. Now let's talk about what this actually does to construction business owners, right? This problem affects almost every part of the business. First, it limits growth majorly, right? A lot of contractors don't actually have a demand problem. They have a capacity problem. They've got leads, they've got opportunities, they've got people calling, but they physically cannot take on more work because they don't have enough labor running for them. That creates frustration because the owner knows the opportunity is there, they can see the growth potential, but they can't execute it safely. And then what happens? The owner works more, the owner, they stay in the field longer, they stop taking days off, they micromanage everything, they feel like they can't trust anyone, and eventually the business becomes completely dependent on the owner. So this creates burnout. This burns them out. And honestly, I think burnout in construction is massively underestimated. A lot of business owners in construction are carrying like unbelievable pressure, right? They're managing payroll, crews, equipment, estimates. They got angry customers, scheduling suppliers, inspections. They always handling delays, weather, callbacks. Tons of financial risk, right? And all while trying to keep jobs moving. And then on top of all that, they're also dealing with unreliable labor. People not showing up, people quitting suddenly, people doing poor work, people creating safety risks. That is exhausting, especially when your company reputation is attached to the quality of the work. One bad employee can damage years of trust you built in your community. And I think that's one of the reasons this topic feels so emotional for a lot of contractors, because it's not just business, it's also personal. A lot of owners built these companies from nothing, and when they can't find dependable people, it feels like the entire weight of the company stays on their shoulders forever. And now here's where I think this conversation becomes kind of a little bit more important, is because from what I'm seeing, the contractors who are successfully navigating this problem best are not necessarily ones like screaming nobody wants to work anymore. The successful operators seem to be adapting to the problem. They're changing how they recruit, how they lead, how they train, how they actually retain employees. And again, these aren't my personal theories. These are consistent patterns I'm seeing from experienced operators talking about this issue all over. One major thing successful companies seem to understand is waiting for the perfect employee may no longer be realistic. A lot of contractors grew up in an era where workers stay with the companies for decades. That's becoming less common for sure. So instead of only hunting for fully developed talent, many successful companies are building talent internally. They're hiring for attitude, work ethic, character, and especially coachability, and then training for skill, because skills can be developed, but reliability, accountability, discipline, those personality traits matter enormously. And I've heard many operators say that I'd rather take someone hungry and train them than hire someone experienced with a terrible attitude. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. Another thing I keep hearing from, experienced business owners is it's the importance of company culture. Now, I know some like older school contractors rolling their eyes when they hear that word culture, but you just hear me out for 1 second. There's a siren in the background. But culture doesn't mean being soft. Cut that out for a second there. Culture means, what it actually looks like to work at your company, because good workers today have options. And if a company environment is chaotic, is disrespectful, disorganized, toxic, or constantly just miserable, people will leave. They just simply leave, especially younger workers today. And many experienced operators are realizing that leadership matters more now than ever, right? So communication matters, respect matters, clear expectations matter. And again, this doesn't mean lowering standards. It means building an environment where good workers actually want to stay. Another huge thing successful companies seem to focus on is reducing burnout on existing crews. Because a lot of businesses actually, they accidentally destroy their best employees. The reliable guys become the go-to guys for everything, right? This means that they carry the workload, they solve every problem, they work the longest hours, and eventually they will burn out. The owners lose their best people, and now they're in an even worse position than they were before. A lot of experienced operators emphasize that, better scheduling, better communication, realistic, workloads, and protecting good employees from constant overload, because retention is just as important as recruiting now. Maybe more important, right? Another thing that keeps, companies, keeps them coming up is the system. And honestly, I think this is one of the most overlooked parts of the conversation. Sometimes workers, fail because the company itself is chaotic. No onboarding, right? No communication systems, no clear expectations, no training process, no accountability structure. Even good workers struggle in a disorganized environment. A lot of successful operators seem obsessive about systems, checklists, SOPs, documented processes, communication standards, safety procedures, onboarding plans, because systems reduce confusion, and confusion creates frustration in the workplace. Now, another thing that construction business owners are starting to realize is that recruiting only happens when you're desperate, right? A lot of contractors used to hire reactively. Someone quits, then the company scrambles to replace them, right? But many successful operators now treat recruiting as an ongoing process. They're constantly they're constantly networking, building relationships, training apprentices. They're talking in, to trade schools, they're actively watching for talent, creating referral programs, because the labor market has changed, and waiting until you're already shorthanded puts companies into survival mode. I also think this conversation reveals something bigger happening culturally in America, right? The trades have been undervalued for years, and now we're seeing what happens when society stops encouraging people to build things, because whether people realize it or not, construction is one of the foundations of modern life. Every road, every building, every house, hospital, school, power systems, somebody built it. And skilled trade, it requires intelligence, real intelligence, problem solving, precision, physical endurance, technical ability, adaptability. These are not lesser careers, even though sometimes they're treated as such. And I honestly think America is starting to slowly rediscover the importance of trades again, especially as people realize that college debt is exploding, AI is changing the white collar workplace, and skilled labor remains critically valuable. And despite all of these challenges, I actually think there's opportunity here too, because companies that learn how to lead well, train well, create structure and build strong reputations internally are going to separate themselves massively over the next decade. not just with customers, but with employees too. Employees are one of the most important things to a construction business, and I think the companies that win long term will be the ones that understand that reliable workers are not just labor. They're like the foundation of the company. So if you're a construction business owner watching this, I genuinely would love to hear your perspective. Like, what are you seeing right now? Like, what kind of trends are you seeing? Is finding reliable workers becoming harder? What's worked for you in the past? Like, what hasn't worked? What changes are you noticing in the industry? Because I think this is one of the biggest conversations happening in construction right now, and honestly, I think we're only at the beginning of it.